Hello and welcome to a new episode of Material Matters with me, Grant Gibson. We're on Series 8, and as regular listeners will know, the idea behind the show is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. The COVID virus is still very much with us, and at the time of recording, England is once again in lockdown. That being the case, we thought it prudent to record this series over the internet. Nevertheless, I'm very happy to say that my guest this week is Tomáš Libertíny. The artist and designer was born in Slovakia, but currently lives and works in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. He burst into the wider consciousness with his Honeycomb Vase during Milan's Design Week in 2007. For the extraordinary piece, Libertíny constructed vase-shaped beehive scaffolds and essentially let nature take its course in a process he dubbed slow prototyping. The beeswax work took 1 week and approximately 40,000 bees to create. It's now in MoMA's permanent collection in New York. Since then, the designer has worked with a range of other materials, including paper, which he turned on a lathe, ink from big biros, and hand-welded layers of stainless steel, as well as refining the Made in Bees series. He's had major solo exhibitions in Amsterdam, Rotterdam and Brussels, while his pieces are in the permanent collections of the Cincinnati Art Museum, the Corning Museum of Glass, and the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, to name just a handful. Tomáš, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Grant. Finally, we get to speak to each other in a proper manner. You've written a few articles about my work, so I really appreciate it that we get to extend our communication channels.
It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Fantastic.
It's a complete pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. I'm looking forward.
One of the first things we do in this podcast is get the guests to describe their studio space, where they work. I don't know, are you in where you work at the moment, or where are you right now?
No, I am at home right now because I thought it would be more appropriate for our conversation to kind of slow down and not be distracted by the work environment. You know, I'm sitting in my library, which is full of books, and that's the place where I like to contemplate. So I thought it would be more fitting to speak with you in this context rather than in the studio.
In that case, we'll cheat a little bit. Can you describe your studio?
Well, that will be easy. It's the same studio I've had maybe since 2009. So almost 11 years. It's a large space in the center of Rotterdam. It's half underground, half above the ground. So it is sort of a basement, but it has a daylight. And it's a former post office building near the central station in Rotterdam. It's generous with space. I have lots of storage room and different spaces for different activities. I have a painting studio, I have the office, I have photo studio, I have a casting room, welding room, sanding, storage. So I feel quite privileged with the studio that I have in the Rotterdam. But I miss daylight. Yeah. That would have been a little upgrade.
Do you have a team?
I work on and off with people depending on the projects. Of course, internship is a regular occurrence, but in terms of staff, a lot of times it's better to work on projects together. So I keep it flexible instead of having a permanent team of 5-6 people.
And how are the Netherlands with the pandemic at the moment? I mean, we're all stuck at home in England. What's the situation where you are?
Well, this is an interesting thing with the Dutch landscape, politically, economically, socially. It's always been quite a liberal country and they don't like being told what to do. So I've noticed it early on, probably sometime in March this year, when the first, let's say, limitations came across different spheres of life in the cities and in the country, traveling included. I traveled a lot to Brussels, and it was a stark contrast between how the people in Belgium and people in Holland handled the pandemic. It looked like nothing was happening in Holland, and there was a crisis in Brussels. So just hopping on the train, I could see a big difference. The Dutch are handling it quite blasé, I would say. Unless there is a stiff regulation from above, they tend to act like it doesn't exist in some sense.
Right.
But I have to say it depends on socio-economical, ethnical differences. So different groups, different wealth, different ethnic background has a different reaction to following the regulations, or let's say looking at them with more seriousness than less seriousness, which is interesting to observe.
Yeah. Is everything open?
Right now, we are in the same situation as you are. So the museums are closed. I think it was about 2 weeks ago that all these tough measures came back again. So it's a little bit like the first wave, but not that strong.
Right.
We kind of got used to it. So things are limited and businesses have adjusted. So, for example, restaurants are closed, but they are now doing regularly takeaways. Even the restaurants that have never done it before on a sort of luxury level restaurants, they also adapted. So it's not only the fast food industry, but also high-end restaurants, which is interesting to see. And lots of different businesses have adopted as well. So,
and how's it affected you, Tomáš?
Well, you asking from like the beginning or right now, the second wave?
Well, we could do both.
Well, the first wave was a blessing, not in a wrong way, like I am pro lockdown. We finished a major project just before the lockdown, and I was ready to work on other projects over the coming months in a sort of, quiet way. So it came like a gift that a lot of things around me slowed down, and there was no fast-paced rhythm to, make you feel anxiety that you're missing out. But it affected me in a way that lots of projects were scheduled to, materialize this summer. For example, we were invited to do the Venice Architecture Biennale,
right.
And we were really busy with the proposal and realization of it. Then it got postponed until September, then it got canceled and pushed to next year. So in that sense, we feel it. And some exhibitions were canceled. But I didn't have anything that totally disrupted my workflow in that sense. So we finished a major project, and a lot of projects were scheduled to be realized either 2021 or we just have more time to make them.
Yeah. So I noticed you spent some time hosting your own chat show, really, the Bus Chairs Conversations.
Right. You have a competition.
Yeah, I do. I don't like it. How did those start?
Well, it started because it's been quite some time, but I've designed, sculpted this marble chair in Italy, and we had it here, and the pandemic hit. And I thought it would have been really nice if we could use this chair, which I thought it would be nice to be placed in nature, to invite people to sit on this chair and speak about the pandemic, being seated in the chair in the context of nature, because, I like nature. I think it's important. And this thing with us having limited access to socializing and going anywhere, nature was the only escape that we had at that time. So people were a lot in the park or just seeking places to, socialize in a way that it's still permitted. And nature and parks was the place, which was interesting to see, to observe that people still feel this way once the whole rush of the city and rhythm of fast-paced work, sleep is over. This is really something we've been missing. And I wanted to talk to people about this effect that the pandemic made us slow down, and inviting them to sit in nature. So the concept was to speak with 12 important Dutch arts and culture people. It was interesting, this whole wide range of people.
Yeah, I mean, they last about half an hour. You had quite a big crew by the look of it. Did you enjoy being a host?
I was a little bit nervous to start with. I've realized that it did me really well. I've really enjoyed talking to other people. I didn't know I was a good listener, but I found out I'm a good listener. I was afraid that with some people I wouldn't have enough experience and knowledge to have an equal conversation. And you'll see that everybody is sort of naked in front of the camera. Like, there is nobody who's not aware, is not afraid. We're all human. So it was interesting to see that we're all the same in some sense in front of the camera. Now being on the other side, asking questions, I've noticed that everybody has a little bit of unrest just before the shooting, which was really cute to see that, people with 20, 30 years of experience of public talk and selling to clients still have a little bit of that self-awareness in front of the camera, being afraid to say something wrong. So that was interesting, but I really enjoyed it. I must say it was an eye-opener for me. Maybe I should do it more often.
I was going to say, will there be more?
Well, first, we still have to put online the last 2 conversations.
Right.
And after that, we'll see what happens. And we have another lockdown. But I thought maybe to speak to another group of people, let's say a younger generation, because in some sense, I interviewed or conversed with, let's say, more experienced demographics within arts and culture. So it would be nice to speak to younger generation, how they felt about this.
I noticed that you gave your guests a present at the end of each show.
I did, yeah.
It's important to point out that you don't get that here, I'm afraid.
Speaking with you is a gift.
Very good, very good. The purpose of this podcast is to talk about materials. You've developed this global reputation over the past decade or more for producing these, well, really exquisite objects created by bees and made from beeswax. The first piece was shown in Milan in 2007, as we said. Can we talk a bit about the process, Tomáš? How are these pieces made?
Sure. Thank you for the nice compliments you gave to this project. Appreciate it. The project started sometime between 2005 and 2006 when I was interested predominantly in consumer culture and I studied conceptual design in consequence. Not that I necessarily wanted to become an industrial designer, but I was interested in everyday objects and the whole myth and tradition surrounding the rituals. And of course, there was lots of Ronarad and Philip Stark and all that to be looked at and enjoyed and criticized. I already noticed there was a lot of this macho culture going on in industrial design where the materials that were used were very masculine. I don't know how to describe it properly, but I felt to look at history of making objects from a different perspective, and I wanted to choose an antagonistic material, which was totally counterintuitive to, let's say, industrial production. And beeswax came across as an interesting choice because it was so vulnerable. Like it's the total opposite of functionality.
When you say vulnerable, what do you mean by vulnerable?
What I mean, it's sensitive to pressure, sensitive to heat, sensitive to light. In that kind of a sense, it's vulnerable. I don't know if that necessarily means vulnerable. I mean, everything is subject to external forces in some way. It felt malleable, so it's easy to destroy, it's easy to affect. And of course, if you have wax objects, the most iconic is a candle. Once you use it, it disappears. It's not something that you can reuse again. So in that sense, vulnerable.
Very good. Sorry, I disturbed your flow because we're just in the middle of the process.
Oh, sure. No, I know. Well, so I left it at choosing beeswax as a,
yes, you chose beeswax
as a material of choice. And I started doing lots of research around it. Of course, we all know it comes from the bees. But that is probably as much as I knew at that time. So I started talking to beekeepers a lot about the process of how beeswax is created and then in consequence learning a little bit about the bees. So the first objects that came from there were revolving around the idea of a vase or a vessel or an amphora, because I thought it was very fitting the whole circle of life from flowers through the beehive back to the flowers. So it had a bit of that circular, not yin-yang, but the kind of complete journey. The bees collect the pollen from flowers, use it as energy to produce beeswax, create the amphora or the vase, and then the flowers on their last journey as cut flowers are put in that vase. It made it very, complete. So that's why the vase is not any other object such as a chair or a lamp or you name it. It wouldn't have a proper meaning in that context. I started experimenting with different methods of having bees create something that I could recognize. And beekeepers also didn't know much about the outcome because I proposed something that was not yet, or nobody ever made anything like that before. So we didn't have any reference. We had a lot of trial and errors, objects collapsing in the beehive or bees overbuilding everything. Eventually, when a vase came out, I didn't know what to think, because when you study industrial design and you study engineering or architecture, you grow up with the idea that what is your plan is also your desired outcome. So you're very specific about your wishes for the end result. And with that mentality, I approached also the work with the bees, but the outcome was never the same as a sketch or the proposal itself. So once the result was revealed, I wasn't sure whether to be happy or disappointed, which taught me an interesting lesson about certain humility and modesty towards nature, that, it's about accepting what is in front of you rather than being a little dictator. like a lot of designers are, with their approach to it has to be like this and radius like that and millimeters. And suddenly there's a process that is intrinsically hard to control. So you have to get used to being less of a engineer and more of the conductor within the limitations of the players who are in your orchestra. So you design the music according to the capabilities of the individual players. So I thought it was an interesting shift from me being very specific to being more open to what could be the outcome.
You've compared it to growing a bonsai tree in the past, I think.
I did, yeah. You regularly have to open a beehive and have a look at how it's going on. So I designed the skeletons, and they don't always follow these templates that I give them. So I have to stir them sometimes by cutting off the overgrown pieces, and then they clean it up and they continue building somewhere else. So you steer the growth of the honeycomb chambers or these cells. And that's what I meant by, growing a bonsai, that you cut and then they move somewhere else, and then you cut that and they move somewhere else. So it is a back and forth process. It's not a push of a button automation unit.
And did you have to work hard to get the beekeepers themselves on side, Tomáš?
In the beginning, and I have to say still, it's very rewarding for the beekeepers, because for most of them, they've never seen anything like this before. So they are very happy to participate and help me with making of these sculptures and projects. Sometimes they're very proud of their bees, like this. They call them art bees, like they're little artists, because the skill is in them. They just haven't explored it. They have used it for other means, harvesting honey and growing the colony in a very kind of modernistic way, because beehives are designed sort of as a modern architecture. It all started sometime in the mid-19th century.
You talk about it being a critique of industrial production and looking to, well, I guess almost feminize the process or the use of materials. Was it just coincidence that when you started making these, that bees started disappearing? You had colony collapse disorder.
It was a coincidence.
Right. So it wasn't part of your thinking.
No, I think I just sensed it. It's my strength, but also weakness. I'm quite sensitive. And I felt this was, like when I saw these polished chairs of Ronarad, I love them. But, this kind of whole visual vocabulary of the 80s and 90s, everything is slick and shiny and hard. And then you miss that kind of softness. I felt this was an interesting way to make a critique, but not necessarily as a social justice warrior, but more in combination with making something beautiful. I don't like making statements just for the sake of it. I like that to be part of making something beautiful as a sculptor or a painter or a photographer, an object to cherish. So it was a critique, and I was surprised that around the same time, Al Gore came with The Inconvenient Truth. I think it was just when I did these vases, and then the whole spirit of, broad public being aware of global warming, a necessity to kind of reorient the economies towards more sustainable production, but also lifestyles. So demanding consumers to demand different ways of production or different products in that sense. Being more responsible came along. So it became part of that vocabulary, and it got adopted by, let's say, more the design crowd as a vehicle for this conversation.
And presumably you didn't mind that?
No, because I agree with it totally. It just didn't start as that. It started much more artistically with reading Dostoevsky and Brothers Karamazov. And I got struck by the idea that he used a main character as a non-hero character. So he starts the book by introducing to the reader that the idea that in this book you will not find a traditional hero. This hero is weak. He is not very interesting, very mediocre, but you will discover that through the book that he is the most consistent and most solid character in the book who survives it all. And I thought, what a brilliant way of trying to choose my hero as a beeswax is for me in my story. That something that seems extremely soft and vulnerable and tragic becomes something very long-lasting because, and I say, beeswax is one of the most durable natural materials in the world. It will last easily 2,000 years without deterioration. We use beeswax for sealing furniture, so it's protected. We use it in food industry, in cosmetics, and bees produce it by themselves, so it is also sustainable in some sense. So I chose a hero like Dostoevsky that seems weak, but in the long run is extremely strong.
One of the things I'm interested in, and listening to you talk just there, is you use the word beauty with abandon. And it seems to me that designers and architects in particular are quite wary of the word beauty, but you're happy to use it. How do you define beauty, I wonder?
It's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. I don't think beauty is definable in a general sense where you say there's an absolute. I am not afraid of beauty. I like beautiful things. I think when I started studying, I wanted to become an artist, but at that time, the art was more into wanting to be ugly on purpose. So I started to be interested maybe much more in design of objects because they didn't mind it. But I read this really interesting book about 10 years ago by Arthur Danto. He's the American philosopher and art critic. And he wrote a book about beauty. And he said that the whole idea, the divorce between art and beauty, started around the time of Duchamp, where he rejected beauty. And he rejected it because he associated beauty with bourgeoisie or something has to do with money. And I think it was more of a statement. It was not that art shouldn't be beautiful. It was a particular statement. And unfortunately, the art world adopted this notion that art should not be beautiful. I think it's disappearing slowly. So that's really nice to see. But the idea is that art doesn't have to be beautiful, but it doesn't have to avoid it. If it can be, why not? So I think that's the whole premise. It doesn't have to be, but if it can, you shouldn't avoid it. So that's sort of my vision or my opinion about art and beauty.
So you're not avoiding it, in other words?
No, I mean, we all seek it. I mean, it would be so counterintuitive to try to avoid it. It's like causing yourself, like we all like things that please us. And obviously, beauty pleases us in some sense. And too much of it is, of course, not good. So it is all about dosage. I mean, we all like chocolate. It feels good, but eating it all the time is also not healthy. And the same goes for good wine, sex, you name it. There are things that have their time and amount, and you deal with it in that way, I think.
Okay. I mean, when you created that first piece back in 2006, 2007, did you think you'd still be working with the process 13 years later?
No way.
How have you refined that process over the years?
That's a good question, Grant. Actually, when I made the first pieces, I thought I was done.
Right.
And here we are, let's say 14 years later, and I'm still excited about making new works. So to answer your question, I didn't plan on it. The second question was?
Well, how you refined the process over that time?
Oh, right. So I started working with more complicated, let's say I challenged the way I work with bees in terms of size, complexity, and color and conditions. First, vases were quite small. Then I diverted from vases and started to make much more, let's say, sculptural objects. I'm still busy with that idea, basically trying to make it more complex, maybe bigger in size, and refer and play with the meaning it creates after it's made and installed in a gallery or in a museum or in a different context, or just a picture. Sometimes that's enough to communicate the idea. I would love to see it one day in an architectural scale. So we're busy with having bees design in a small scale an architectural form, and then we would scale it up, scan it, scale it up, and fabricate in different materials. So using bees as sort of a quantum computer to calculate architectural tensions on a small scale. And then we use that as a foundation to build it in a different scale from different material. A little bit like architects use complex softwares to design their buildings. I have this biological quantum computer called Beehive to design a building or a facade or a gate or what have you.
I'm very intrigued by that. So how do you go about doing that? Presumably you set some framework up for the bees to follow.
Yeah, so in the beginning, we had very rudimentary methods where I would design this kind of positive, negative spaces. It's a bit like mold making. And that didn't always work because bees like to work within a very small confined spaces, but then it's hard to take it out. Then I introduced, let's say, copper skeletons, wooden skeletons, and right now we are 3D printing complex skeletons. It proved to be the best method. So we design most of the sculptures on computer, and then we 3D print it. Yeah. And then we use that as a foundation.
So something like the Agreement, which was a 1.6 meter tall sculpture outside the Natural History Museum in London,
right?
That would have been 3D printed originally, and then the bees worked on it.
That was an exception to the rule.
Okay.
It was a very complex method of creating a hollow, double curved surface form. It was sort of like a pipe bending and an opening that looks like a flower. And I wanted it to be completely hollow. So we had to create a skin for the bees to build on, but we also had to create a load-bearing skin, offset it next to it. We did it with etching metal. So we were using stainless steel, very thin stainless steel sheets, and we etched those. So using this photographic method where you project a film on a surface and then the acid eats away the lines. So it was very, very precise a way of getting metal strips, but they were bent in 3D. They were under tension, and we had to use a software for designing boats, which you use to calculate how the wood bends when you make the body of a boat. So that was interesting kind of cross different sources, different methods. So I try to make these skeletons different way all the time, but right now we're busy with 3D printing, but I tried everything that's possible, from metals, etching, acrylic, depending on form and what it needs. I also made the unbearable lightness, which was this Jesus-like figure floating in the space with red skin, red beeswax skin. And that was, the inside was completely 3D printed, glass-like foundation.
Can we talk about your background? You were born in Slovakia. Your father was an architect.
Yeah.
Your mother a historian.
Yes.
How has that shaped your career, I wonder? There's obviously a huge literary background in your household, I'm guessing.
I grew up with books, that's correct. My birthday presents were always books. Depends on who gave me the books, so sometimes it was geography. My father always gave me, this is interesting, my father always gave me books about nature and art. I only look at it back now, like, oh yeah, there was always nature, geography, these kind of things. Yeah, and mom would give me more literary kind of, fiction books to read. But everywhere I went, whether it was my grandparents from my mother or my father, they both had huge libraries. So yeah, that affected me. So in that sense, I grew up in an intellectual family.
There was art in the house, obviously. Were you constantly making things?
I was actually constantly disassembling things.
Right.
That was one of the tragedy of my parents in my childhood, that when something arrived at home new, I would probably take it apart and not be able to put it back together. I was always not making. That's really interesting when I look at it. I was always taking things apart.
You were encouraged to do that? Or did they get irritated when they got home to discover everything?
No. They got irritated, of course. But I would be endlessly curious. So I was more seeking probably knowledge and understanding rather than trying to be expressive. If you look at it from the point of view of you create to express yourself. And I put things apart to be able to understand how things work.
Yeah.
And I still think I carry that kind of sense of, like, I'm interested in the making of things more than probably the end result. Or I'm interested in both. That's why we're still talking. Material matters.
It's interesting because, you talk about this knowledge of how things are made and why they're made. And you started by studying engineering and design in Slovakia. Then you went to the University of Washington, where you focused on painting and sculpture.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that shift came about.
I think I felt in my 20s that engineering wasn't enough in terms of being complete. So I knew that I was driven towards art one way or another. I just probably wasn't willing to accept at that time that I'm more an artist than, let's say, an industrial designer or an architect. Because of, let's say, more inputs and the complexity of my thinking. When I studied in Slovakia, probably I sucked out everything I can. I need more. I'm curious more about what's in America, what's in stock there. And I wanted to taste that educational process and be exposed to American art, American museums, the culture. And I think art education there served me well because it was so broad. I could involve different things in the studies rather than just engineering.
From there, you went on to the Academy of Fine Arts and Design in Bratislava,
right,
before going on to the Design Academy Eindhoven, where you received your MFA.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a lot of time in education. Did you stay so long because you thought your work wasn't ready?
It seems long, but I just did a lot within a short period of time. So I think I studied within 6 years or 7 years, 5 places. So it seems like I studied a long time, but I graduated when I was 26, 27, something like that. I think I couldn't stay at one place for more than 2 years. I felt I've squeezed out a lot, and there was nothing more to squeeze out after 2 years. So I think that's why this kind of hopping from different place.
Yeah. What did your student work look like? Maybe when you left Bratislava for Eindhoven, what kind of things were you doing?
That's interesting. I had a lot of actually works that were referring to nature. That's interesting. I had lots of student projects that dealt with nature, mathematics, and I had a huge painting portfolio. So I did a lot of painting, drawing. That was sort of my student work, experiments in nature and mathematics. I think the mathematics has something to do with father's discipline, so architecture. So it's kind of logic behind nature. What Olaf Eliasson made his oeuvre with, obsession with geometries and things like that. So I was already then busy with those things, nature and mathematics. Now it's not even a surprise that I'm busy with these. Yeah, you make me realize things, Grant.
Well, there you go. That's why we're here.
That's your gift.
It is. I'm glad I've got one. Were the bees happening in Eindhoven or after you left?
It started in Eindhoven. Yeah, it started in Eindhoven. One of my first projects there was I was doing a big research on Coca-Cola.
Right.
And I did this big project about Coca-Cola, doing lots of research and some design artworks. And I think it stemmed from there, where it was a critique on, let's say, the product, the iconic image of it, and then this artificial sugar overload of the whole drink. And I think that sugar thing led me to the bees somehow.
Right.
This critique of consumer culture, because it's such a thing. Like even Ai Weiwei has this Coca-Cola on a Chinese vase. Like you can't not go criticizing consumer culture and let's say capitalism by not using Coca-Cola in one way, like once somewhere. You know, I think it started there with Coca-Cola, and I recently used it again after 14 years. In my last show now in Amsterdam. So back to Coca-Cola.
Back to Coca-Cola. All roads lead to Coca-Cola. I want to change tack slightly because there's been a very lively debate about copying in design in the UK this year.
Sure.
That was created by the designer Simone Brewster, who started a high-profile campaign against a manufacturer that hadn't paid her for her designs before putting something extremely similar out on the market. I mean, it's a problem you've had your own brush with. Back in 2013, there was an advert for Dewars, which had a sculpture of a bottle of whiskey made by bees.
Yeah.
How did you feel when you saw that?
I was outraged. And the reason was not because there was a context. The advertising agency behind it, the Canadian advertising agency, contacted me. They wanted to do this with me. And I think a few hours before the conference phone call, they pulled out. They said, well, small internal changes, will contact you when we are ready. And then nothing happened. And then I think it was a half a year later or like 3/4 of a year, they came out with this project. It was advertising project where they commissioned somebody from California to do this. But it was so similar in many ways to what I did that in the very instance I was pissed. But then I calmed down. I mean, it is what it is. It was an interesting subject because just around the same time, somebody else approached me that wanted to make a copy of my work as a study for school project.
Right.
And I thought, that's interesting. I got involved, and the student, she made a replica of my honeycomb vase that's in MoMA, trying to replicate the process. So I gave her hints, and she tried to make it similar without having all the information, sort of like reverse engineering it.
Yeah, yeah.
And then she displayed it in a gallery, in a show, and I thought it was very nice. Then I wrote, I think you're referring to the essay I wrote on the zine.
Yeah, subsequently, where you kind of pointed out that in your view, there was a place for copying in design education.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's absolutely necessary. And I think there is a lack of it, on the contrary. I think it should be much more encouraged. Copying is a way of learning. We just somehow became so obsessed with the whole issue of copyrights and being original and unique and new, that we somehow don't realize that part of growing is to grow on shoulders of others. There is another issue, of course, exploiting it financially, but that's a different subject. I think in education, I would totally encourage, if you study furniture design, make a replica of Eames furniture. Just reverse engineer it, make it yourself to understand how these things are made, instead of taking it for granted, like just looking at the sketches, having a hands-on experience on, could I make it myself? Because at the time, if you look at the books of the Eames couple, you see how much of their initial processes were all studio-based. It was not all factories, production companies. A lot of them were initiated in the studio with their own means of making models. So I think that's interesting to learn by copying others. But it all, of course, I wrote the essay in defense of copying, but with a tongue-in-cheek reference to, exploiting intellectual property.
Yeah. I mean, the other interesting thing about that piece, and we've talked about your love of reading, is that you write with quite a dash. I mean, you quote everybody from Bruce Lee to Picasso in the same piece.
Oh, thank you.
That's all right. So writing is presumably very important to you.
I do write, but I don't write enough, I think, because there is no incentive for me to write. I mean, I don't get a regular place in any newspaper or magazine. So it sometimes is about the opportunities, and it costs time and energy. I feel like I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. So to write a piece, and I'm sure it's not sitting one afternoon. Probably also take quite some time. You write the first draft, second draft, you go over it, you erase. It can take you a couple of weeks to write something meaningful that you're happy with.
I just blat it out, Thomas, for money.
No, I don't believe it. You're a pro. You don't do it like that. No, let's sell the idea that Grant works for months.
Yeah. Pay me more money for it. That's what I want.
Exactly.
There's another quote of yours that I like, which wasn't from the design piece, it's from somewhere else, where you said, I don't think one should expect anything from contemporary art. Let's think of it like a cat. So I'm interested to know how art is like a cat.
Art is like a cat because when you walk into a gallery or a museum, we come there with sort of these preconceptions that art should please us, or art should anger us, or that somehow art, museum, gallery owes us something. And we come there a little bit with the same sensation like we come to a movie theater, where we've seen the trailer and we have these expectations that this is going to be a really entertaining movie, and this is going to be really a great comedy, lots of laughs, and we're going to leave this place and then we're going to get a drink, all good mood. Art works in mysterious ways, and I compared it to a cat because I'm a dog lover, and I love cats as well. And we have cats in Slovakia, so I kind of I grew up with cats as well. But cat is such a creature that it doesn't work on a command. It's there when you let it come to you, and it will gift you its presence. But you can't be overwhelmingly dwelling on expectations from a pet like that. Every time you get pleasure from a cat, it's almost like in unexpected times when you come home and you're sad, and the cat feels it and it comes to you and it comforts you. And it's not always something you can rely on, but somehow it reveals its true nature. It's very independent from, it's not like a tool that you just grab when you need it or a medicine. And I think it's similar with art. Artists don't work like this. They somehow reflect the current situation that we live in. And you come to a museum or to a gallery, or you look things online, and you just have to look at it as a testimony of the time we live in. But it is not your pet that's supposed to please you. Just kind of have to wait for it to grant you its presence, and it reveal itself. And sometimes works of art are, ahead of time, and they are not easily consumable. They will be more consumable in 2 decades when there is enough visual and other type of vocabulary present that you can properly consume it. And there are many examples of artworks like that. So, yeah, I compared it to a cat more than to a dog. I think design is more like a dog.
Well, I was going to ask you that because you are doing that much more to command, right? We tend to be, if you're an industrial designer at least, you're working to commission or a brief.
Absolutely, yeah. But you also use tools to cater to somebody's needs. You are much more in service to society, which I think is equally important. But design is much more about being maybe a doctor than a musician. I think we all need doctors, but we don't necessarily need musicians to survive. But you can argue about that. I think if you ask somebody else, they say, I can't live without music, or you can't live without art. Well, but you can't live with cancer. You can't survive certain diseases either. So there's this pyramid, shelter, clothes, food, and I don't know what the pyramid is called. I think we have to Google it.
Well, you've opened a can of worms there, which I'm not sure I'm going to go any further into. But what we've discovered in this hour we've had talking together is that you're a man of many parts. And aside from the Made by Bees series, you're also a photographer. And there are pieces where you've used other materials. Your paper vases that are turned on a lathe spring to mind. Mm-hmm. I was particularly interested in the work that uses ink from big biros. How did that come about?
Yeah. I think it's also a really early work, it started really early, maybe 2 years after the bees. I was really interested in the big ink pen, which, by the way, is in the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection as an industrial design object. And I find it extremely interesting for the reasons why it's there and its design. But I was interested in the ink itself, and somehow my painterly history kicked in, and it's becoming sort of this complementary thing to the work with bees, which is almost predominantly yellow, and I have the blue, and now I'm waiting for my red period.
You've done red though. Your vases are red sometimes.
Yeah, it is. So let me first finish the blue, and then I can explain why some beeswax pieces are red. I think there is something beautiful about the depth and the sort of the melancholy of the blue color. It's a really interesting color. It has a beautiful history, reasons why it was used already in antiquity, what sources it was made from which natural materials it was made from. And in general, history of colors is interesting to see which colors were most valuable at what times and what periods they are reflected in fashion. I found blue like one of those mysterious colors, and because probably I tend to be interested in things that are somehow unknown, mysterious and spiritual. I think the blue is a very good medium to draw the audience into that same mood of contemplation. So I like the blue ink because of its chemical composition. When applied on different materials, I made many mixed experiments with different surfaces, and I found out if you use certain types of woods, the big ink acts iridescent, like a butterfly wing. So we looked at the microscopic images of the butterfly wing, and I found out that there are these membranes that trickle down like Christmas tree, which shortens the wavelength of the light hitting these chambers. Because of shortening them, these wavelengths have different scale between the purples and the blues. Because if you look at the spectrum, I don't know which wavelength is the blues, or how many nanometers. But this is the effect. So channeling it down, certain types of woods we found out when you cut it in the right angle, there are tiny tubes. And when you apply ink and the ink is on the inside of these minuscule tubes, when the light gets trapped inside and if you look it from different angles, it creates the same effect. So with this, I almost designed the way to make these, what I call bluescapes, using certain type of wood and layering the big ink on the wood to achieve this butterfly wing effect. Now I'm continuously busy still with sort of painting with the big ink, because it's made from this mixture of pigments and chemicals that act really well on dry surfaces such as wood. It's designed to be used on paper. Therefore, wood is like a grandmother of paper.
It's fascinating because I thought you'd tell me about, the disposability of the Bic pens and we'd have a discussion about sustainability, but that's not behind this.
Absolutely, no. It tends to look like it.
Yeah.
But I was more interested in the melancholy of the blue than, let's say, the disposability of the pen, like you named it. But I think it's a huge problem as well. And I absolutely agree with it. But I'm not the type of artist that would, my good friend Hayward, what's his name? The British designer that makes chandeliers out of collecting...
Stuart Haygarth.
Stuart, yeah. I don't know, I said Hayward. He makes absolutely stunning pieces and they directly communicate this idea. So I think the work is done there in this territory.
Yeah.
There's nothing to be more done. So Stuart got it. I think the message is clear and he managed to also create something beautiful with it. Kudos.
Well, I'm very keen to get him on here as well, actually.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah, I should. I've taken up loads of your time, Tomáš. Final question. It's the inevitable. What are your plans for the future?
Near or far?
Oh, both.
Both. I would really like to continue with the portrait series of Made by Bees. We just finished a few sculptures that one is based on Nefertiti. So I created the replica made by bees of the bust of Nefertiti. And I created another one which is similar to the bust of Michelangelo of Brutus, the assassin of Julius Caesar and the famous story, and also you, my son. So this kind of, killing a tyrant, and Michelangelo did it because at that time Brutus was considered as a good person. He killed a tyrant, but sometimes Brutus is also looked as a traitor, and Julius Caesar is a great general. So there's this duality of history. But in essence, I like the Made by Bees project to be extended more into architectural scale. As I mentioned early in the interview, I think it would be interesting to use animal kingdom in this kind of metaphorical way as a quantum computer to try to see if we can get different type of information than we get from using, let's say, real computers with their own methods of calculation and approximation. And they still look kind of dry. If you look at architecture these days that tries to mimic nature, it's always somehow still very artificial mimesis. It's not real, That's why I admire the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona by Gaudi, because somehow you look at it, these interiors, and they're so irregular and regular in the same time that you think this is not made by the computer. There is nothing that's correct. And if you compare it, for example, with Frank Gehry, you feel completely the opposite. I feel Gehry is very computer-like, design on a computer, and Gaudi, I feel like it's made on site. That's my feeling from Gaudi's work, that it's made naturally, like they just started from the foundation and started building it up, as like growing it. So my hopes for the future is to make architectural scale artworks with the help of the bees.
Very good. Very good. Well, we very much look forward to that, Tomáš. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Grant. I appreciate it. Looking forward to hear it and also the other interviews.
Thank you so much. To discover more about Tomáš's work, go to tomášlibertíny.com. There are images from the interviews as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. And I have a new website. You can find all the podcasts that I've done, sign up to my newsletter, and lots of other stuff at grantondesign.com. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this from. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to my Patreon page and make a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience. Thanks so much for listening, and please stay safe and well.